Fantastic, thank you. Mr. Altman, thank you.
I was going to ask you about Medway, Mr. Saunders, because you'll recall, as I reminded you earlier, that the Panorama programme went out on the 11th of January of 2016. As it so happens, it was that programme which influenced Callum Tully's actions, because it was the following day he emailed the BBC with the results we are all aware of. And as you've already told us, you were parachuted back into Medway by Mr. Petherick, was it? And he, in collaboration with others, to, as you put it in your first witness statement at paragraph 7, offer leadership and stability to Medway.
Yes.
Have I got that right? So let's just look at a couple of paragraphs of the executive summary for the report. Zainab, can you put up, please, INQ 000010 at page 6 and 7, starting at 6. Before we go through a couple of these passages, do you agree that there are clear parallels between the findings at Medway and what happened at Brook House?
In terms of staff behaviour not being as it should be in
punitive use of force, control and contract compliance, and the sort of issues. You're familiar with this report, I would have thought, aren't you?
Yes, I have read it. It's been a little while, but yes, I have read it.
Well, let's have a look and see if you agree as we go through certain aspects of it. If we look at Roman 5 to begin with, the board found that there was a lack of clarity on the purpose of an STC, that's a secure training centre, and that leadership within the STC has driven a culture that appears to be based on control and contract compliance, rather than rehabilitation and safeguarding vulnerable young people. And we'll come back to it in a minute, but contract compliance was one of the big issues here as well, wasn't it, at Brook House?
Sure, yeah.
Yeah. Roman 6, there are blurred lines of accountability and an ambiguous management structure. A clearer child-based vision needs to be driven by strong leadership. Do you think there were blurred lines of accountability at Brook House and Tinsley House at Gatwick IRCs, run by G4S?
No, I don't think that was necessarily the case.
But you agreed earlier the systems, processes, teams and structure clearly failed.
Yeah, clearly, because we witnessed the behaviour on Panorama. Yeah. But I would say that there were plenty of other examples of where the systems and processes succeeded.
Such as?
Well, I mean, I think there was a lot of the processes and procedures were effective in looking after people within our care.
Such as?
Well, we had examples of detainees who would write letters thanking us for looking after them, thanking members of staff. Yeah. HMIP reflected very positively about the management of use of force, suicide and self-harm, Rule 40, 42 use. And so I think there were some examples, clear examples where processes were largely successful. But that doesn't necessarily... I mean, I appreciate that we've seen the behaviours through the Panorama programme, which clearly show that they haven't been entirely successful. But I think to say that they entirely weren't successful isn't entirely accurate.
Although HMIP, I think, rather changed their mind after the Panorama programme, didn't they, about Brook House?
Well, I think HMIP inspect and report on the findings that they find during each inspection. Yeah. And I think inevitably, when an inspectorate, and I think HMIP are a very credible inspectorate in my experience. They're informed and experienced in assessing healthy establishment tests in establishments, in custodial establishments, and I think it's reasonable for them to consider, in light of Panorama, what they inspected against and how they reported in 2016, which was a very positive report on the whole.
While I have it in mind, the report which preceded the relevant period of this inquiry is that which was signed off by Peter Clark in January 2017, but it related to an inspection between the 30th of October and the 11th of November 2016, as to which Callum Tully told us in his evidence during this phase of the inquiry. First of all, he was aware of it, although it was supposed to be an unannounced visit, that he and others were aware of the visit. Is that right, do you think, that people were aware of it before it happened?
Well, I think the way in which HMIP conducts its inspections is that they will arrive unannounced on a Monday morning, typically with the lead inspector and a number of researchers to carry out surveys of groups and individuals, typically detained persons and staff, but mainly detainees in my experience. And then they would return. They would do that for 2 or 3 days in that week, and they would return the following Monday with a full inspection team. So, yes, it is unannounced. They do arrive without informing us of their arrival. But then you know that they're going to be coming back in a week's time with a full team to inspect.
But is there any possibility before they turn up on the Monday morning of anybody knowing that they're going to be coming?
No, not in my experience at all.
Not in your experience. But they would know that they're going to come back after the initial visit.
Yes.
Yeah. And in your experience, did you or anybody under you present Brook House in a way which was not reflective of the place it was, or the way it was ordinarily run, in order to impress or mislead the inspectors?
No, never. There was. I was always keen to present the best of what we did in terms of the centre, but I would also find very valuable indeed the feedback from inspectors about anything that we could improve upon. So I was very keen to present a true reflection of the centre and make sure that we could benefit from reinforcement of what we're doing well, as well as guidance and recommendations about how we could improve.
For example, by reducing the capacity of E-Wing or the CSU, by shipping people out, is one thing that Callum Tully told us had happened, that it was emptied out in order to present a better impression of E-Wing and the CSU.
No, that doesn't resonate with me, I'm afraid.
Doesn't resonate at all. Or shipping in extra staff to make it look like the staffing was better.
No, that doesn't resonate with me either.
Going back to the Medway report, at Roman 9, they added there's a history of similar concerns being raised repeatedly in letters from whistleblowers and former staff. The board feels that policies which form part of the STC contract need to be reviewed to ensure that they support the overall safety of young people rather than focus on contractual penalties. Whistleblowers and children inside of the STC need to have an effective support framework in which they feel safe to raise concerns and complaints. So those are just parts of the executive summary in Medway which I pick out. So culture based on control and contract compliance, blurred lines of accountability, you don't accept that. Concerns about the organisation supposed to be safeguarding and scrutinising, which is part of this executive summary. A history of similar concerns being raised repeatedly in letters from whistleblowers and former staff. All of these were pretty serious criticisms of Medway, do you agree? And you've read the whole executive summary. It's far from a clean bill of health, and further into the report, it talks about use of force with disproportionate and punitive use of force. All of this, the whole report, not just the bits I've picked through in the interest of time, but all of the report is a stark reminder to somebody like you in a position as centre director of an immigration removal centre, about issues of leadership, issues of culture, use of force, and the weight to be given or not to be given to the contract, which under which you run a centre like this. As we know, you were you were seconded back to Medway in January to around June, was it, 2016? When you returned to Brook House, this report having been published on the 30th of March of 2016, so during the period that you were back at Medway, did you have all of this ringing in your ears, as it were, when you returned?
I certainly had, yes, I certainly had some thoughts around it. As I said before, I formed the view that what happened at Medway could happen in other centres. I discussed my experience of Medway with the SMT and articulated that we should be alert to the kind of behaviours that we saw at Medway, and that something like that could potentially, not that I thought it would, because I didn't see any other signs from walking around, from members of staff, from the SMT, from IMB weekly reports, from HMIP feedback, from healthcare, from the Home Office. I didn't have any inclination that what we saw at Medway was what we might see at Brook House.
Well, that can mean one of two things, can't it? One, it wasn't happening. Two, it was, but it was being hidden.
That's right.
So what did you do to ensure that, number two, that it was happening but was being hidden, wasn't in fact occurring?
Well, I think what I did was reminded the SMT that they should be cascading through their departments the message of making sure that we are being professional in what we're doing, that we should be vigilant of staff, and that we should be reporting practice that we're not completely happy with.
Was that it?
Yes, perhaps I could have done more, but that was the messaging I was giving.
I mean, one might think, I don't know, it depends on the way you run the place, but one might think of finding an opportunity to write a letter to all of your staff, all of the DCOs, all of the DCMs, or meet with clusters of them individually, tell them what the Medway report said, and absolutely get across your point that this was never going to happen under Ben Saunders' watch. Did you do that?
No, I didn't do it in the extent that you've described.
Yeah, and how do you know your individual members cascaded down to their departments that kind of message? What confidence do you have that the message got through, if it was ever given?
Well, with the benefit of hindsight and seeing the footage on Panorama, I'm not confident that was passed through.
Well, whose fault is that?
Well, I as I said to you at the start, I take ultimate responsibility for the operation of Brook House. Yeah. So I suppose that sits with me and my team.
You will have read in Michelle Brown's witness statement that she says that she told both you and Stephen Skit, we're going to have a panorama on our hands here if we don't learn from Medway. Do you remember that?
No, I don't.
You're not going to suggest she's made that up, are you?
No, I'm saying I don't remember her.
You just
saying
don't remember. So is it something you think you'd be likely to forget, given everything that's happened?
I don't know. I don't know how to respond, I'm afraid. I don't remember Michelle saying that.
Because she said that when she said that to you and Steve Skit, there was no reaction or acknowledgement from you.
Like I said, I was cognizant of wanting to give the message to the SMT that it was important that we did our assurances through our management structure, and if there were any concerns that we had about individual members of staff, then we should address it with them and be clear about the expectations of behaviour.
Let's have a look at what you told Verita, VER 000226 at page 38. Sign up, thanks. and you see a, a lengthy answer at 550. And it's really the second line down. I was very keen, especially after the Medway experience, because I went back there for 6 months after the Panorama programme, and I was very keen for there not to be a blame-type culture, because my experience of Medway was that was a fear of what the consequences might be. Therefore, I was very careful in my language, and in morning briefings I would talk about accountability, because we all have accountability. We all have to justify our actions, but there were also lessons to be learned, and let's talk about it in terms of a lessons learned exercise, particularly something like reviewing a situation of restraints, which becomes quite emotive. People can still have feelings related to it, so the timing of talking to people is important. Is what you described to Verita what you've described to us about what you did about Medway, or is that just part of the story?
Well, I mean, this rings true, you know, in terms of being conscious of my language. I mean, I think, you know, part of the issue that I experienced at Medway was, and I think it's true in places like Brook House and others, is that when you have close-knit teams, there can be a difficulty in speaking up against one's colleague, because sometimes you might find yourself in positions where you need to be really supported by that person, and it can be scary if you're not sure about that support. I also think that some of the reason why people hadn't reported some of the behaviours that they should have done was fear of disciplinary action, and I think sometimes, you know, it's important to be firm in terms of disciplinary action, but I think in other ways it's important that people feel able to speak up, and that there's a learning opportunity.
So why were you having to be careful in your language?
I think what I meant by that was I didn't want to appear as if I didn't want to present a situation where people were going to be scared to speak up.
You think it changed anything?
I don't know.
I said earlier I think that I would come back to the Home Office. You can take that down, thanks, Zainab. Do you remember I showed you a paragraph of the draft Verita final report a little earlier, 7.6 and onwards, that you gave everyone the appearance of focusing above all on maintaining good opinion and fulfilling the expectations of the Home Office. Do you remember that?
I do.
And it's something you've accepted, that you were ensuring that the relationship with the Home Office was good, and you were looking after external stakeholders. Who were the other external stakeholders you had in mind?
Well, there are a number of stakeholders involved. The Home Office are clearly one, both from a contractual point of view, but there are multiple elements to the Home Office engaged in the day-to-day work at an IRC. I suppose I would include some of my senior managers in that, in terms of reporting and you know, keeping informed about performance. But I suppose there are a number of other stakeholders that would be involved. The IMB, for example, healthcare. There were a number of other organisations who came in to deliver services, migrant help, for example.
So you mean like Gatwick detainees?
Yeah, Gatwick Detainee Welfare Group.
Yeah, and others like them.
Yeah.
All right. I'm sorry, Zainab, can we stick back up the interview, please? VER 000226, this time at page 20. At 249, just above, you're giving an answer. And you say, I talk very explicitly, very clearly around the importance of doing our job with a very clear consideration for the human element of what we do. You were talking about morning briefings, new ITCs that would come in, the new recruits, presumably, for the initial training course. Then you say, frankly, the Home Office didn't really care about the people we looked after. And that's a very general kind of comment, and I wouldn't want it quoted in that way in the report. There are elements of people in the Home Office who did care very much, but the Home Office entity corporately was mostly concerned about the removal process and the functionality of it. And so the question then follows, could I say frankly the Home Office corporately didn't really care about how you looked after people? And you say, or didn't appear to. Maybe we had a number of examples, and then you cite an example. And then a little further down at 254, was that then losing sight of the humanity of all of this, or was this actually, we want to create a slightly more hostile environment? It sounds like more humanity, just a big machine. And you say the hostility, there is this hostile environment approach, isn't there, to people who shouldn't stay here in the country. There was an element of you've had opportunities to leave before now, and now you find yourself in an IRC, so you have brought on yourself a kind of attitude is what I found. And you go on to say you were struck by desperation that you could see in people, and so on and so forth. Does that accurately reflect your experience of the Home Office line?
I think I did experience elements of that. I was concerned always about the care of detained persons, and I took that as a responsibility of mine to make sure that we looked after them humanely, and clearly we've failed in that, but that was always the intention, and we succeeded in some cases, many cases. I think when in terms of the contract conversations I would have with the Home Office, certainly there was a focus on elements of delivery that linked with the immigration process.
Yeah.
So official visits, for example, ensuring that arrivals and discharges were completed effectively were clearly a focus.
Yeah.
And I did have some experience of where it felt that there wasn't sufficient consideration about the welfare of some individuals, that particularly, a particular example in mind is somebody who was due to leave, and we would always want to make sure that there were places to go to for that person, so they could at least know where they were going to stay the next night. Yeah. And they were able to travel there and successfully and safely.
But what you seem to be saying there, if we just scroll back up to 249, please, is the Home Office didn't really care about the people we looked after, and that's a very general kind of comment, so you say it's a generality, and you didn't want it quoted. There are elements of people in the Home Office who did care very much, but the Home Office entity corporately was mostly concerned about the removal process and the functionality of it. So the distinction appears to be that there are some people, Home Office officials, who did care. And are they people who worked within Brook House or others you met outside during meetings?
Both. I think there were certainly people within Brook House and the Home Office who cared.
Yeah.
Who cared? Certainly.
But what your overarching feeling was, as a corporately, the Home Office was more interested in getting these people out of the country.
I think that was the appearance that I had on occasion. Yes.
And what was the hostility? You talk about a hostile environment, or you seem to agree with the questioner.
Well,
that it was a hostile environment. Why was it a hostile
I think
environment?
I'm thinking about if I put myself back in the time, there was an approach which was about a hostile environment, which I think was linked with discouraging people from coming to the UK in the first place.
So what? Not to make it a pleasant place to be detained.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the more hostile you make it, the less likely that person is to try their luck again, or others like him.
Yeah, I'm not talking about the IRC in that sense. I'm talking about a general approach to coming to the UK.
Lee Hanford and if we can put this up, please, Zainab, his Verita interview, VER 000266 at page 22. At 288, he says, and what I found quite alarming when I came here, 2016, when we started writing the bid at the same time as well, there were some elements of criticism aimed at G4S staff from outside, not from G4S, from the Home Office, about showing too much empathy, supporting detainees in their appeals and the like. That's what staff will do. They're going to build rapport, grow that relationship and support. And you often hear people saying, it says Immigration Removal Centre, that's what it says on the tin, and it's about preparing people for removal. And then a little further down, when I was here nearly 2 years ago, there was some criticism aimed at those who empathised to that extent. And he adds, I acted as an advocate for a number because you do that. That's what we do to fellow humans. Did you find the Home Office unempathetic?
I think there were sometimes moments when I felt that it was.
Yeah.
I think it sometimes did feel as if it was focused on process,
Yeah.
and there were clearly some expectations about wanting to minimise the length of time people should
Yeah.
stay in detention, and therefore move people through that process as effectively and as efficiently as they could.
And were you aware of the criticism, he says, that was levelled at G4S staff from the Home Office about showing too much empathy? Were you aware of that?
I'm aware of his observation of that.
Yeah.
I haven't experienced that myself. What I've experienced has been people who are sympathetic to the position that detained people are in. They're often feeling very desperate in the situation they're in, and I think my experience of the majority of staff that I spoke to about it was that they were keen to help those individuals through the process. And I think one of the, well, if not the biggest frustration that detained people articulated to me when I spoke with them, and what staff reported, was frustrations with the Home Office process, access to caseworkers, and being able to progress through that process to resolve their case in one way or another, whether it were to be returned to their home country or whether it was to be allowed access into the UK.
Moving on, let me ask you a few things about culture. Nathan Ward, in his first witness statement, deals with training and attitudes, and we can put it up on screen, DL 0000141 at page 82, please. And at paragraph 232, he's here dealing with training. And his point, without going through all of these paragraphs, you may have had an opportunity of reading them, Mr. Saunders, we've looked at this before, is that the trainers who were trained as instructors by the National Tactical Response Group, brought with them, as it were, and cascaded down effectively into Brook House in training new recruits. As he puts it right at the bottom of paragraph 232, a negative, macho, aggressive culture. And you yourself, when you spoke to Verita, we don't perhaps have to look at it, but it's at page 41 of your Verita interview, you agree there was a very male, very macho culture as regards CNR. Do you accept that?
I'm not sure if I entirely accept that. I think I can see why that can be seen sometimes. I think sometimes male members of staff, there were more male members of staff than female members of staff, but I think male members of staff, were more likely to be part of the response teams.
Yeah.
It was something I challenged because my experience is that often situations can be diffused by people with different skills than their physical size and how they impose themselves.
As I think I said to you before, we've heard of a laddish culture. I've suggested to you some of the terminology that was quite rife, and which we've been treated to in the course of this inquiry. But do you not think that focusing in on the use of force, the aspects of use of force, and what Nathan Ward has to say about it, that there was a risk that it became too male-orientated? And if so, clearly Nathan Ward is talking about this in a statement he's made to the inquiry, but he left in 2014, so we can almost time his views. And here we are in 2017, where we've looked at a number of use of force incidents and some of the issues which arise from them. If it persisted then it persisted in the years that followed, and I'm just wondering why nothing was done about it.
Well, I don't remember Nathan raising those points with me, so that's his statement. I'm not suggesting he's lying, but I don't recall him raising those statements as allegations with me. I think in terms of use of force, I think we had processes in place to quality assure and review incidents, but I also accept that we could have done and should have done more to review that in terms of scrutiny and lessons learned.
Do you remember asking Nathan Ward to complete an internal stakeholder staff survey in 2013?
No, I can't remember.
Well, we've got the statement up on screen. Can we go to page 45? In paragraph 134. In 2013, I was asked by Ben Saunders to instigate the Investors in Diversity scheme at Gatwick IRCs. This involved an internal stakeholder survey, which was completed in or around April 2013, which represented a snapshot of the incidence of low staff morale, inflexibility of working hours, and favouritism in Brook House. Some of the answers included, and he goes through the list. There were a couple of questions, and you can see the URN. We don't have to put it up on screen. Is DL00000142, which is the actual survey. But part of that survey highlighted the presence of racism, discrimination, and bullying. And that was 2013. And I'm just wondering what steps you took to deal with that.
So,
do you remember it now?
I have some recollection about the Investors in Diversity scheme. Yes. And I also, I'm reflecting on this because I started in September 2002, so this wasn't that long after I started at Gatwick. And
do you mean 2012?
12, sorry. Yes, 2012. Yeah. Sorry. So when I went there, I was part of what Jerry said to me was that it required more rigour. And what I found there was that there were elements of feelings from the staff team that there was nepotism, that there was favouritism. I don't recall any particularly racist culture or behaviours, but we were very clear that should any issues or complaints be raised or reported, that they would be taken seriously, and that there was no place for that within the organisation. I recognise some of this, and it was useful, and I think we talked. Nathan and I reviewed this, and we I can't remember specifically. It's a long time ago. But I'm sure we took it into account in terms of how we were going to move forward.
Unhappily, it doesn't seem to have worked as far as the racism is concerned, because John Connolly, who was an employee in 2013, was there seen on the stairwell in one of the wings on the 17th of May. And you'll have seen this on Panorama.
I did. I dismissed John Connolly.
Yeah, advising Callum Tully to use a racist epithet more than once,
That's right.
which must have astonished you.
It did. It did. I was shocked because I found that absolutely unacceptable, outrageous. Actually, I didn't expect that to hear that from John Connolly or anybody else. We went to great lengths to ensure that through recruitment and training that we were very clear about the types of values that we wanted our staff to have, and the expectations of professional behaviour, and how clearly we were about our expectations of racism and any form of discrimination. So yes, I was absolutely shocked to hear that, and there was no place in our organisation for that.
Callum Tully, when he made his witness statement to the inquiry, and if we can put that up, please, INQ 000052, page 42. Paragraph 166 said he believed that a significant minority of DCMs and DCOs engaged in abusive and oppressive treatment of detainees. A number of staff members, some of whom were managers, humiliated and degraded detainees in vulnerable positions, such as those suffering with mental health conditions, those who were the subject of medical emergencies, or those at risk of self-harm and suicide. Some staff took pleasure in the suffering or abuse of vulnerable detainees, and he makes the point that he'd given examples of it throughout the statement. Although it was a minority of staff members who engaged in this behaviour, I feel strongly that the consistent and undisguised nature of the abuse demonstrated a systemic failing of the detention centre. You prepared to accept that? It was systemic?
No, I don't accept it was systemic. That's, I think if I had been aware of the behaviour that Callum's describing, then we would have taken serious steps to have investigated and removed those people.
At 167, he says, in the majority of examples outlined in this statement, members of staff were present during mistreatment of detainees and for admissions of abuse and malpractice who were otherwise well-behaving officers. This underlines the lack of confidence staff had in raising complaints about such behaviour, and that directly answers what you just said to me, Mr. Saunders. Do you not see that there was a lack of confidence to escalate these kind of problems?
That's what Callum is presenting. But
you accept it?
Well, that's what Callum's presenting. My view is that if Callum had spoken to me about these instances, then I would have taken it very seriously.
And he calls it a culture of silence in paragraph 168. Across the workforce at Brook House, coupled with a lack of demonstrable oversight, interest and engagement from Ben Saunders and his senior management team, allowed the abusive culture in Brook House to fester and go unchecked. The confidence that officers and managers had to, in front of other members of staff, flagrantly brag and joke about abuse, or speak in derogatory or even racist terms about detainees, demonstrated their faith in the culture of silence which allowed the abuse to persist. He's got a point, hasn't he?
Well, clearly from Panorama we saw some behaviours that were racist and that were abusive. I'm not convinced there was a culture of silence, although I'm really extremely disappointed that staff members did not report those behaviours, including Callum Tully himself, who had a duty to report. I was never made aware of any instances of abuse or racist behaviour, and as I've said, had I been aware, then I would have taken some serious action to investigate and manage that.
But it's all rather troubling because the whole thing fell under the radar as far as you're concerned, didn't it?
these officers who behaved,
Yeah.
who we saw on the programme, yes.
And they were quite senior officers. We have Jan Pashali. Did you know Jan Pashali?
Yes,
Yeah. Derek Murphy. Did you know him?
yes,
John Connolly, you clearly knew him.
yes,
And a host of others.
absolutely.
Charlie Francis, not so much swearing, but unfortunately shouting at D1527 on the 25th of April, as I reminded you a little earlier that he was an idiot or behaving in a particular way when he clearly couldn't help himself. Dan Small saying that this place had made him racist. And on it goes. Yet not one person reported that. We're not just, Callum Tully's one person. And you'll know he was 18 or 19 at the time. But nobody else escalated these issues up to you, ultimately. And there must be a reason why, Mr. Saunders.
And I've considered that, you know, a lot in terms of my reflection, and I think it's often complex, but it doesn't take away from the fact that those officers had a duty, including Callum Tully and others, had a duty to report,
Yeah.
and they failed in that duty.
Yeah, but that's a cop-out, isn't it, Mr. Saunders?
No, I don't. No, I'm not trying to move away from my responsibility around it.
Mm.
I'm stating a fact that you know, we had very clear expectations. We articulated them to every member of staff.
Yeah.
That as certificated custody officers,
Yeah.
they had a duty to safeguard people in their care, and that included reporting.
Yeah.
So I accept that there are some complexities to that, and it's a challenge if you're working with people, you know, early in the morning, late at night, through some difficult challenges with people. Then you build a rapport, and that can, I think, that can make it difficult to report behaviours that you're not happy with, and that can be a difficult conversation. So I think it is a challenge for staff, and something that organisations and operations who operate centres like Brook House have to consider seriously about how they can enable people to speak up and report without either fear of retribution or fear of consequences.
Yeah. I mean, for example, Tully told us that a speak out poster or posters that were on a wall outside, as I recall it, some lavatories in part of the office area, had been defaced with snitch, grass, that sort of idea. We were told by somebody else that they were taken down regularly. But did you ever see those?
No, I didn't see those. I did hear about them being defaced from
When?
Occasionally. I can't
Well,
give you
in this inquiry or before this inquiry started?
before this inquiry.
Yeah.
I heard of that.
But if that's what's going on, and if members of staff are seeing that, you know, if I report, if I use the Speak Out hotline and I report what's going on here, then my life isn't going to be worth living within this immigration removal centre. So what message does that send?
Yeah, I appreciate it's not a good message, which is why those posters were, you know, would have been replaced quickly, because I would never want a member of staff to get a message that that there would be any, you know, negative consequence to reporting. I think you know, I know from experience that the whistleblowing line at Gatwick was well used. So, and that indicated to me that people knew of its existence and had some faith in and confidence in using it.
Stacey Dean, she was the head of Tinsley House before she left.
Yes.
Is that right? And you remember that there came a time when she was off with stress. Michelle Brown was off. Do you remember I reminded you earlier, for a while she was exhausted from the workload and she had complaints about you. And both of them, Michelle Brown and Stacey Dean, repeatedly raised concerns about staff treatment of detained people. Were you alive to that?
Sorry,
Were you alive to the fact that the pair of them had raised concerns about staff treatment of detained people? Were you alive to that?
I can't recall any specific issues being raised, but if issues were raised, then we would investigate them.
Well, let's have a look at what Stacey Dean has told the inquiry in a witness statement. Can we put up, please, INAB INQ 000172? At page 3. And if we expand paragraph 8. I've been asked to respond to the point that Ms Brown raised concern at an SMT meeting at which I was present. I do recall regularly that Ms Brown was one of the SMT members who repeatedly raised concern about staff treatment of detainees. Both myself and Ms Brown were concerned that some members of staff as well as detainees were being regularly subjected to bullying behaviour from some staff. The response of the SMT was consistently uninterested. I do not recall specific dates or times, but do remember the general approach to any of us raising concern or complaint would be fairly generic and non-committal, and the lack of any action was frustrating. At times, I think the view from some SMT members was that the situation was amusing, so it was far from taken seriously. Do you recognise that?
No, I don't recognise that.
Well, again, if we are prepared to assume that Stacey Dean hasn't made it up just for the sake of it, it's rather concerning, isn't it?
Yes, but like I say, I don't recognise Stacey's description of that.
Yeah.
I think if Michelle or anybody else had raised concerns about staff treatment of detainees not being as we would expect it to, then we would have investigated that.
Well, what about Owen Sirod, Mr. Saunders? Let's put up on screen, please, INN 000007. Page 30. On one occasion, I witnessed a colleague making a racist comment, and I was interviewed as part of a disciplinary investigation into this incident by Conway Edwards. The incident concerned my DCO colleague Sam Gurney. Completed my initial training with Sam, seemed like a nice guy. However, when I returned in 2014, there'd been a big change in him, and he openly stated he was racist. Some of the detainees were being quite demanding, and he commented, "I bloody hate this lot, no wonder I'm racist." This took me by surprise, because when I'd known him before, he was a sensible person. I said to him, "That's not you," and he responded, "It makes you feel like that," and I just left it there. A couple of weeks later, he was in the wing office on C Wing using the computer, and another DCO colleague, Liam Sharkey, was eating a packet of plantain crisps. I asked Liam what they were, and Sam interjected and said they're crisps for niggers. I couldn't believe what he'd said. I knew I had to challenge the comment, but I didn't want to do it in front of the detainees because this could have caused disruption. A detainee was stood nearby, and I wasn't sure if he'd heard everything that had been said. The detainee said to me, "Did I hear what I thought I heard?" I told the detainee I would deal with it, and the detainee said, "I trust you to deal with it." I reported the incident to Conway Edwards. And then skipping down to the next paragraph, 127. Following my report of this incident, I started to receive post-it notes stuck on my locker that said "nigger lover" and "grass." And for about a year afterwards, friends of Sam in the control room would follow me around by camera and raise bogus reports to try and get me into trouble. For example, a complaint that I'd shaved in the barber's while on duty, which was false. I was also told by a colleague to watch my back and that people had it in for me because I'd reported Sam. I reported this behaviour to the director, Ben Saunders, and recommended that future recruitment should focus on more mature candidates. Do you remember this?
I do remember having conversations with Owen Syward.
And what happened? What did you do about it?
I can't remember specifically because I'm sure I spoke to Steve Skit about it and to see whether we were able to establish who had been writing those notes. But I can't specifically remember the outcome.
You see,
and I think with hindsight, I mean, because I can remember talking to Owen, and I think with hindsight, I would have gone back to Owen to make sure that he was providing the necessary support that we should have given him.
What did you do as far as Sam Gurney was concerned?
I can't remember specifically, but my vague recollection is that we did go through a disciplinary process with him, but I can't remember specifically.
You see, here we have Owen Syward, who had done the right thing, and his life was made a misery by being accused of being a nigger lover and a grass. So he's abused, and he's effectively made to feel uncomfortable in his workplace. And Callum Tully, who was much younger at the time that he decided to go undercover for the BBC, is someone who you'll remember in your witness statement, Mr. Saunders, you speculated did it for financial gain and career progression. Was that constructive, do you think?
I'm not sure whether it was constructive or not. I think
whether you were being constructive in saying to this inquiry and thinking it was a good idea to say to this inquiry that your speculation was Callum Tully did it for financial gain and career progression.
Well, I'm disappointed in Callum Tully in that he didn't report the incidents that he witnessed, and he chose to do that through a journalistic forum. I would have far preferred him to have reported that, and for us to have been able to investigate and prevent any further safeguarding issues from occurring.
I've asked you. I'm moving on now. I've asked you about Medway and what processes or measures were put in place after Medway. Picking up on that theme and looking at oversight generally, what process was followed by you upon receipts of reports such as Stephen Shaw in 2016? I mean, I assume you've read through that.
We did at the time, yes.
And by the same token, the HMIP report, which we spoke about a little earlier, January 2017, the foreword or preface signed off by Peter Clark, the inspector, chief inspector, and the inspection, as I reminded you, between the 30th of October and the 11th of November 2016. What processes were actually followed after those reports to make sure that any criticism, and there was plenty of them in Stephen Shaw's report, including of Brook House, what processes were followed?
Well, thinking back, we reviewed those reports as we did. I think from memory, I haven't read Stephen Shaw's report for some time, but from memory, I think he was. It was a report about his visits to all immigration removal centres, and we considered the feedback and we discussed that as a team, considering how we might implement any feedback from him, and in conjunction with the Home Office about some of the feedback I think from memory he referenced things like care suites and
yes,
those types of things.
Yeah. But was there a formal process? Did you have committees? Or
I'm sure we incorporated some of the actions from that into our action plan.
I mean, Stephen Skit in his inquiry statement goes through a number of the recommendations that were accepted, part accepted, and completely rejected in the HMIP report, to which I just made reference. But what about Shaw? How was that dealt with?
In a similar way, we would have gone through the report. Certainly, it was something that the SMT were familiar with and had read. And as I say, I think we discussed with the Home Office locally and more widely about what recommendations were going to be implemented across the IRC estate, and certainly my focus was locally on Brook House and Tinsley House.
Who decided on which recommendations to accept or reject from, for example, the HMIP report? What's your recollection?
So the HMIP report is something that once received, it would be obviously reviewed by us, and we would consider the recommendations. We would then go through a process with the Home Office where we would meet or do it via conference call to go through the recommendations and determine which to accept and which not to. And then there was a further process where once we'd agreed which ones we would accept or reject, and I say this because some of them were based on Home Office policy, so there was some that the Home Office were not happy to accept. We would then go through a process of identifying actions to respond to those recommendations, and we would go through a further process with the Home Office to agree and sign those actions off.
Something I'm asked to ask you, Mr. Saunders, what about the outcome of and judgments in litigation in which the Home Office has been involved, touching on the conditions of detention in Brook House? Were you made aware of judgments, and those which not only touched on the conditions of detention, but adverse findings on Article 3?
I can't honestly remember picking those up.
Presumably you would have remembered if you had, and it would have been important to have done so, because if the High Court had determined of Brook House that a particular detainee had been detained unlawfully and in breach of Article 3, oughtn't that be something you should have known about?
Yes, and if that was the case, then I'm sure we would have discussed that with the Home Office.
But you can't remember?
I can't remember off the top of my head now, no.
Are you saying you never were, or you just don't remember?
I don't remember.
I asked you a little earlier about your approach, and you told us, and you accepted, that you were outward looking towards the Home Office and external stakeholders. One of those stakeholders you identified a little more recently was the IMB. And of the IMB and your relationship, Nathan Ward thought that you were too close, and their independence was compromised because of it. Have you seen where he said that?
No, I haven't.
He said it in the witness statement I've taken you to more than once. It's his paragraph 317, and I'll simply read to you what he says. I believe the relationship between senior management and the IMB was also too close, and their independence was compromised. I was aware that the director, Ben Saunders, used to take them out for lunch regularly, which I felt was inappropriate. Generally, however, there was a feeling not to worry about the IMB as they didn't have as much clout. Did you take them out for lunch?
No.
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 So that's a fiction.
Yes.
Did he ever raise this with you?
No.
No. So he completely made that up.
I have no understanding about what he's reported there.
No.
I had a positive relationship with the IMB. I recognise the importance of the independent role the IMB perform.
Yeah.
I know you're meeting with the chair next week, and my experience of her was that she was an experienced chair of an IMB, having previously been the chair in a reasonably local prison, and I really valued her insight and that of her members. And I think the IMB can often be thought of as a bit of a stereotyped organisation, but I think actually they perform a really important role in custodial settings because of their independence and neutrality. So I was very keen to hear whatever the feedback was, whether it was positive or negative, or things that we needed to improve on, or detainees certainly felt able to speak to the IMB and staff, because that came back to me in regular reports from IMB from both Tinsley and Brook House. And I think in addition, and I know you know this already, but there was in addition to Jackie Colbrand, the chair, and her experience in being a previous IMB chair. There was also a former prison governor in the Brook House IMB, which was really helpful because it enabled him to understand a degree of context around secure care.
So as far as you're concerned, your relationship with the IMB was entirely appropriate. It wasn't compromised in anything you'd said and done.
No, I think the integrity of that relationship was sound.
Right. And so wherever Nathan Ward's got that from, he's mistaken at the very least.
I don't know where he's got that from. It doesn't. I don't recognise anything what he's described there.
Right, let's move on, please, Mr. Saunders. The contract. Can we consider something that you did in 2014? Do you remember your 360-degree contract review?
Yes.
And if we can put that up on screen, please. It's CJS 000768. And what was the purpose of this? We see it's got your name on it, version 15. It's the 24th of June, 2014. What's the point of it?
I think this was, again, following, I think it was following the electronic monitoring issue,
Yeah.
and it may have been something else, I'm trying to remember. But it was certainly a process that we were asked to do to linked with our customer relationship and the kind of the management of the contract. So it was a template that I received and was required to complete, and then I can remember attending the G4S head office to talk it through with senior executives.
Yeah. If we go, please, to page 5. And you're here describing the nature of the relationship with the Home Office, presumably. Is that correct? Because
It looks like it.
that's the other contracting party. And the second bullet, beginning Cabinet Office audit, you talk about Brook House being subject to... I mean, did you write this or did you have help with it?
I think I wrote this.
Brook House was subject to an audit by Moore Stevens on behalf of the Cabinet Office. Findings were positive. Overall, for both Brook House and Tinsley, we found that the systems and controls were in place and operating in a way which ensured that accurate, complete and contractually compliant invoices were raised by the provider. The majority of recommendations and comment was focused at the Home Office, although there was clear feedback that our mechanisms for self-reporting and assurance were not adequate and required development. Pausing there, self-reporting of what?
I think I'm referring to the self-reporting of performance against the contract.
So performance failures? Or
Or performance...
generally?
Just generally, I think.
Yeah. Are you talking about the monthly performance reports that we've seen for 2017, for example?
I think what I'm referring to here is, I think I alluded to it in my statement, it is a situation where when I arrived at Gatwick, it felt like, and I think this has been unpicked through some of the investigation, that the rigour with which the Home Office monitored the contractual compliance was not as robust as it could be.
Yeah.
And from memory, that was some of the findings from the Moore Stevens report, was that it was critical of the Home Office's monitoring of the contract.
Yeah.
And made some recommendations for the Home Office to improve that. I think it also suggested that G4S was not the performance reporting wasn't sufficiently good to enable effective self-reporting. So it was something that I wanted to develop.
And did you develop it, do you think?
Yes, I think yes, I think we did, and the reason I think that is that we went through a process of developing an assurance framework that enabled us to report positively on what we achieved and to ensure contract compliance, and it meant that we were better able to self-report non-compliance.
The next bullet, practice at Brook House is held up as excellent in a number of areas, including the effective removal of challenging detainees and in managing detainees who threaten to self-harm to prevent removal. Did you write that as a focus of what you were doing at Brook House?
I think I wrote this in the context of the relationship with the customer, and the impression I was given by the customer was that the practice at Brook House was effective in being able to remove some of the most difficult detained persons to remove.
Yeah.
And the point around self-harm is that there was a tendency for people sometimes who didn't want to be removed to self-harm to prevent the removal at the point of removal.
If we go on to page 11, please. Here you're setting out, on the previous slide, we don't have to look at it, customer contact management meetings. And here we have a meeting, health and safety meeting, contractual. Does that mean by contract you had to have a meeting, what, with Home Office officials about health and safety aspects?
Not. I don't think it was necessarily about contractual health and safety. I think it was a contractual requirement that we had a health and safety meeting established.
Right. Internally or with the Home Office or what?
Internally.
Right. The committee's objectives are to recommend, instigate, develop, monitor and review actions to ensure the health, safety and welfare of all persons affected by the activities within Gatwick IRCs. It's pointed out by other core participants who've asked me to ask this, that welfare hardly features in this whole series of slides. It features there, welfare of all persons affected by the activities, but welfare of detainees. And so the suggestion is, when we look at the focus I've just asked you about on page 5, and I'm asking you and zeroing in on this word welfare, I don't think we find it very often if we word search throughout the presentation.
Okay.
Why do you think that is?
I don't know. I mean, I think this. I think in terms of welfare, then it's often linked with kind of welfare staff, and that's a slightly different kind of connotation. But I think it's set within the health and safety purpose, and I think it would be included in the representatives from the members of staff here.
Yeah. On the issue of self-reporting, Ian Castle gave evidence to us on the 15th of March last week. Do you remember Ian Castle?
I do. He started not long before I left, so I don't have a long experience of working with him.
But he said that there was no incentive on G4S to self-report, and that the Home Office just had to rely on G4S. Do you think that's right?
I think the nature of the contract was reliant upon self-reporting.
Yeah.
I think, and this is slightly anecdotal because it's a little before my time, but I think the Home Office, just prior to me starting, did reduce the management of Home Office representatives, and that there was previously a compliance and an operational element to the management of the Home Office function.
Yeah.
And I think that was reduced, so there was just one Home Office manager who was required to fulfil both of those elements.
So what, that was a disadvantage to them and an advantage to G4S, or what?
I wouldn't call it an advantage. I mean, I think, my view, my experience was that we reported very transparently to the Home Office.
Yeah.
The integrity of and transparency of that relationship was something that was very important to me.
Yeah.
And that's my experience. We reported very honestly to the Home Office.
Mr. Castle was asked whether he could explain why during our relevant period, so April through to August, when one looks at all the monthly performance reports, despite the number of ACDTs and the number of incidents of self-harm, and we know that there were 60 on analysis, 60 incidents of self-harm during the relevant period, why not one of them was self-reported or attracted any penalty points? Mr. Gasson, who was also somebody you clearly did know,
Yes.
Paul Gasson, he couldn't explain how he checked if there had been a breach of contract by self-harm resulting in injury. And what he said was, to be honest with you, I don't know if we did. I don't remember doing it. So we had two Home Office officials who really couldn't understand the procedures. I asked Mr. Petherick a little about this yesterday, and I don't want to rake over everything I asked him, or equally in the interest of time. But can we just put up, please, HOM 000921, please? Are you familiar with this Schedule G,
Yes.
Mr. Saunders?
It's obviously been some years since I looked at it, but yes, that is familiar.
Yeah. Once seen, never forgotten, I suspect. And if we look at the bottom of page 2, under untoward events, right at the bottom by Roman 3C, right at the foot of the page, self-harm resulting in injury attracts 400 points. And then if we fast forward to page 5 for the definition, untoward events under C, self-harm resulting in injury, there are effectively 3 elements to this. Any known incident of deliberate self-harm, so well, in fact 4, it's non-accidental, deliberate self-harm, resulting in physical injury, that's the second element, requiring any form of healthcare intervention, that's the third, and involves any failure to follow laid down procedures for the safety of detainees as set out in Schedule D. Schedule D is not a light read. It's 226 pages in length. It's got 22 sections, if my memory serves me. Section 14 of which deals with detainees at risk. Now, who made the decision about self-reporting injury, physical injury from self-harm requiring the intervention of healthcare? Who made the decisions around whether such an incident had to be reported or not?
You're talking about reported as a contract failure?
As a contractual failure, yeah.
Well, that was well. Can I just take a step back, because firstly, all incidents of self-harm, including those involving injury, were investigated by the Safe Community team.
Right.
So,
who was that? Pause there. Who was that?
So that was a team of people who were Safe Community managers. I think we had one at Brook House, we had one at Tinsley House, and Conway Edwards, the diversity manager, was part of that team as well.
Who was the one at Brook House?
I can't remember the name.
On the SMT?
No, below. It was a DCM level.
DCM.
Reporting into Michelle Brown on the SMT.
Right.
And so every incident of self-harm would be reported on an incident report. It would be reported to the Home Office as part of the regular monthly reporting, and it would be all incidents of self-harm would be reviewed as part of the Safer Community meeting, which was a monthly meeting chaired by Michelle Brown typically, and attended by the Home Office, IMB, and indeed detained people.
Right.
So we did report every incident of self-harm, including those with injury, to the Home Office as part of our regular reporting. And we reviewed them in the meeting in the presence of the Home Office. So I don't accept that there wasn't any reporting of them. what I think you're alluding
No,
to
I wasn't
is
saying that there isn't, because we've had this evidence. What I'm alluding to, as you're about to tell me, is why none of them resulted in a points award during the relevant period. Because if we look at all the monthly performance reports, we won't find a single penalty point awarded for self-harm resulting in injury, and that's what we want to know. Why not?
because I think our interpretation of the contract was that if a self-harm incident resulting in injury was to be contractualised in terms of penalties.
That's a terrible word, Mr.
I know, I'm
Saunders.
sorry, but that's kind of what you're alluding to is how we report contractually in terms of failures and penalty awards.
Yeah.
Incidents of where people have seriously harmed themselves.
Yeah.
So actually, we went to a lot of trouble and care to make sure that we looked after people who felt the need to self-harm, and which was reflected back to us very positively. And I think so. In terms of the contractual element to this reporting, we interpreted the contract as we would incur penalties in terms of Schedule G should the self-harm resulting in injury have resulted from a failure in our staff to follow the laid down procedures.
That's what I want to know, though. Who poured over Schedule D and the incident itself to satisfy themselves one way or the other that there was no failure to follow laid down procedures under Schedule D? Who did that?
Well, that was part of those investigations that would then flow up through Michelle in terms of her oversight of the Safer Community meeting, and I think part of the Safer Community meeting that was held was about any lessons learned. So were there any things that we could have done better or differently, or learned any lessons from any near misses, for example. So ultimately those reports came up to me, and it was I ultimately signed off the reporting to the Home Office on a monthly basis, and that was done in conjunction with the Home Office. The Home Office, as you say, I don't know particularly how much scrutiny they paid to incidents. Not a huge amount, I would suggest.
No.
But we discussed contractual performance on a weekly basis with the local Home Office manager, and monthly, and we reported on a monthly basis.
Where do we find all of that recorded? Where should we find, if we wanted to look, to find a Safer Community report on a self-harm incident which resulted in injury with the intervention of healthcare? Where do we find it written anywhere that this particular incident does not result in our self-reporting that we have failed under the contract because we have followed in all instances the laid down procedures under Schedule D? Where should we find that?
Well, I think you'll find them in the investigation. If there was a failure, it would be found in that investigation post incident.
Yeah.
And that would be flagged to Michelle.
Yeah, but I'm looking at where is the final record? If we wanted to see this particular incident happened on this particular day, here was the physical injury, healthcare was involved, it was deliberate self-harm, but G4S has followed the laid down procedures, or it cannot be said that G4S has not followed laid down procedures.
I'm sure that would exist in the investigation, because if there were any failings in the process, then that would be identified in that investigation.
Yeah. And what kind of failures are we looking at?
It would be identifying things in terms of the ACDT process. So, for example, I don't know. An example might be if somebody, say for example, there's a situation where a detainee is coming into Brook House and has got a history of self-harm, but we haven't taken that into account as part of the initial arrivals admission screening process, and then that person subsequently self-harms, then we haven't appropriately taken account of that history and made our own assessment of that individual coming through.
And in what form did you sign off on the decision-making in relation to each incident? How did you sign off on it?
Well, it was reported to me, and I relied on I relied on the report from Michelle, and there was a monthly Safer Community report that was submitted to me and to the Home Office, and was the basis of the monthly Safer Community meeting.
No. So if we have those, we should see in each of them the kind of decisions and thinking being set out in writing.
Yes, I would hope so.
You would hope so. I mean, you do say, and Chair, I'm alive to the fact that we should have a break imminently, but you said to Verita in your interview that it was true when it was put to you that the Home Office that Verita had spoken to had conceded to Verita that they had not scrutinised contracts as closely as they might have done.
Yes.
And that echoes what you told us a few moments ago.
That's true, and I think that echoes what the Moore-Stevens report found as well.
Because as you said to them, their primary focus was all about the removal process.
That's
So
right.
we go full circle, don't we?
Partly, and certainly, the conversations I had, they were tuned into performance around the removals process.
Yeah.
But I think it links in with my determination to report transparently and openly, irrespective of the findings about the Home Office process to monitor us. I still had a very clear value and determination to report transparently.
Yeah. Chair, slightly later than we might otherwise. By my watch, it's just gone 20 past. Shall we say about 22?
22. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Saunders. Thank you. Thanks. Thank you. Mr. Altman, thank you.
In light of what you were just telling us and what I was asking you about, Mr. Saunders, the Safer Community Team meetings and the report you were talking about, I'm going to ask to put up on screen CJS 000625. And you see it's a document with loads of statistics on it, headed Brook House Safer Community Report. This one, July 2017. And it tells us the ACDs open in July, open ACDTs from other locations, those still open from June, actual self-harm in July, in this case 13, closed ACDTs or transferred out, and those carried forward into August. And then broken down by age, self-harm by age, ACDTs by nationality, and self-harm by nationality. And if we can scroll up, please, by religious faith, in the case of ACDTs and self-harm. Is this what you were talking about?
It's part of a monthly report
Right.
for Safer Community.
What else should accompany it?
My memory of the Safer Community report was that it was slightly bigger than that, and
Yeah.
it was it gave some narrative as well about some of the nature of the self-harming behaviour.
Yeah, because what you described earlier, nobody's recognising. That's the trouble, Mr. Saunders, and I just wondered if you can shine a little light on why that may be.
I don't know. I'm providing evidence that there was a monthly Safer Community report that, from memory, was larger than just one sheet of paper,
Right.
and that was that had some narrative to it that explained a bit more context, because I'm sure you'll appreciate, self-harm can range in seriousness from something that's fairly superficial to something that's extremely serious and life-threatening. So you don't get the context of that from just figures.
No, well, that's exactly why I'm asking you.
So
whether this is it.
Well, that's not my memory of the entirety of the report. The monthly report I recognise had more narrative that explained some of that context.
Yeah.
And as I said, it was provided on a monthly basis to the IMB, to the Home Office, to us, and formed the basis of the monthly Safer Community meeting review.
Let's just put back up on screen, please, your Verita interview, VER 000226, at page 9, please. And on page 9, if we begin at towards the bottom, please, Heiner. And at 109, Mr. Marston's asking you about trading reviews. And you say at 1110, I will say that I know I've talked about money quite a lot, but we were in a good financial situation. I'm sure you know how the contract was operated financially in terms of the fixed fee. So there were no variable earners to that. We made our savings from looking at how we could save on budgets that we had set against the year, about any kind of savings opportunities we could do, being more economical with cleaning products. And he asked, is it squeezing and using some logic? And you say, yes, exactly, and it is quite small figures. Staffing vacancies generated some profits because you were saving on costs that you had already looked at. Therefore, we were typically in a good position financially because we didn't incur massive, great penalties. Generally, the big penalties were coming from things like escapes in terms of large figures, but from a penalty point of view, We were very transparent about how we reported any performance failures. Through the course of me being there, we developed a much more robust contract assurance model, where previously, I have to be honest, the Home Office were sloppy, frankly. They didn't scrutinise the contract at all, and certainly that's the impression I got from the previous director as well. There was a Cabinet Office audit done a few years ago following the electronic monitoring of all large contracts, and the Home Office was slammed by the audit report because of their lack of contract monitoring, partly. Is that a reference back to the Moore-Stevens report?
Yes.
And if we go back to the previous page at the bottom, at 112, staffing vacancies generated some profits because you were saving on costs that you had already looked at. What were you saying there?
Well, I think staffing was the largest cost. So if you had vacancies, then you didn't incur that cost.
And were staffing vacancies being maintained in order to avoid costs?
No.
So why were you saying this?
Because it's a fact. I think through the course of managing a centre like this, you would typically go through recruitment exercises, which would involve recruiting people. And because of the nature of the recruitment and the nature of the DCO roles, it took some time between advert and operational go live. So, it could take up to 4 months sometimes if you included the initial training course, vetting, notice periods, etc. So when you were recruiting, you had to forecast ahead. Based on the attrition that you'd had, historically, to forecast ahead to see how many you needed to recruit.
Yeah.
And that sometimes could take you over budget, but the flip side of that is that sometimes there would be vacancies which would naturally occur through attrition. And we struggled, I would say we struggled to recruit at times at Gatwick because of the local job market, and there were particular employers, including the airport and security, that would sometimes do recruitment drives, and that would make recruitment quite challenging. Yeah. We tried a number of different tactics and strategies. We had a recruitment and retention strategy, and that involved looking at our adverts to see whether we were attracting the right people, that the imagery was positive in terms of attracting people, that the salary was benchmarked against local job market, and that our terms and conditions and benefits would be attractive to people in terms of our offer, and we struggled. I think it's difficult in the context of recruiting into places like prisons and like Brook House. You're obviously looking for the right value base in individuals, and also there is a vetting requirement for you to be a fit and proper person test in order to be certificated. So that can exclude a proportion of the population sometimes and make it more tricky.
And we also understand that recruitment was an expensive business.
Yes, it did involve quite significant costs.
Yeah,
but I would say, there was no decision by me to not recruit staff. The costs that would be incurred in recruitment, the costs that existed anyway. So, the costs that I heard former colleagues talking about recently involve the salary, for example, of the training of individual DCOs, the training costs, the uniform costs, those types of.
Yeah, well, there was all of that Mr. Petherick told us yesterday in order to recruit, and it involved other costs, although he didn't mention salary, was £7,000 a head.
Yeah, I would expect that to include that individual salary through that training course period.
But that's what I meant, but not the annual salary, but the cost of taking on someone, including the 6-week
yes.
ITC and the advertising and all the rest that goes with it.
That's right.
It's quite a lot, isn't it?
It's the necessary process you have to go through. None of us would want to have to maintain large staff vacancies, because I certainly wanted to have a stable operation, and I think one of the elements that helps a stable operation is having a stable staff team,
Yeah,
and we struggled with that at times.
Just wondering then why you said what you did. I mean, when Mr. Marsden was talking about squeezing and using some logic, yes, exactly, quite small figures, staffing vacancies generated some profits because you were saving on costs that you'd already looked at. I mean, just wait for me to finish, if you wouldn't mind, Mr. Saunders. Why are you saying that, given everything you're telling us now? If you weren't maintaining staffing vacancies in order to make savings, what was the whole point of you saying this?
Well, he's making a point about the financial performance, and I'm not referring staffing vacancies to squeezing or using some logic. I'm pointing out the fact that staffing vacancies was you weren't incurring staff costs, so therefore it became part of the budget.
That's not what you're saying. You said staffing vacancies generated some profits because you were saving on costs that you'd already looked at. So what you were saying is, we budgeted for so much, but if we had staffing vacancies, that was to the advantage of G4S's margin because it generated profits. I mean, those are your words, aren't they?
They are my words here. I'm saying what I mean by that is that by having through staff vacancies, I'm just talking about facts. I'm not talking about any strategy, but just by the fact of having staff vacancies meant that you were more profitable, because you weren't incurring the costs. But you did have. Sorry, I should add to that. What would offset that would be overtime in terms of fulfilling the staffing requirement at the of the daily staffing requirement.
We've heard that often.
Yeah.
But we've also heard from some former staff members that these were long shifts of 13.5 hours, of about 46 hours a week, which the impression I think most people have gained, staff didn't particularly like. Are you saying there were some staff who actually did overtime based on those shifts?
Yes, there were staff that did overtime, and I think we worked with the union and with representatives of the staff team to review the shift patterns on a number of occasions, including putting it to the vote. And I think in any establishment of this type of this nature, you're never going to please everybody. And I think my view was that the majority of staff favoured the longer shifts. It wouldn't have been my personal preference, but I would have preferred to have shorter shifts. But a significant amount of staff at Brook House came from quite far afield, and they found that to be positive. And I think if we had changed it, we would have seen quite a large amount of attrition.
Now, the original contract, which we know was awarded to GSL, albeit G4S took over the company, bought the company, so took over the contract, was February 2008. Do you know offhand how many years that contract was for?
I'm sorry, I can't remember.
10-year contract, 8-year contract?
Something in that region.
Because what we do know is that you were working on a rebid for a new contract, certainly writing it up in January 2017 with a deadline in February 17. Do you remember that?
I remember working on the bid.
And the renewal, I think, would have been 2018, which has puzzled me a little because in his witness statement, and I'll simply reference it and tell you what he says, it's Stephen Skitt, SER 000455, it's his paragraph 159. What Stephen Skitt said in his inquiry witness statement was during the relevant period, in other words, April through to August of 2017, he said Gatwick IRC was basically running on contract extensions, which he believed was to its detriment. Is that your recollection?
I can't honestly remember, but it's quite possible that the contract was extended.
Well, if it was extended, that rather suggests it wasn't a 10-year contract, and at some point during that period from 2008 onwards, extensions had been granted, but there was a new contract in 2018, and that's what you were working towards in terms of retendering. Would that sound about right?
Reasonable. Yeah.
Yeah. And if one looks, and I'm not going to, in the interest of time, go through them all, but if one looks at several SMT meeting notes, certainly one in October 2016, we don't need to put it up sign now, but CJS 000583 talks about you updating on the progress of the bid, which will be written in January with a deadline in February. You may have seen that in your documents. And you wanted everyone to be careful of friends or ex-colleagues working for competitors, not to give out information to them that could jeopardise your bid opportunity. Do you remember?
I don't remember, but it
Yeah.
sounds reasonable.
And then in another SMT meeting note, CJS 000555 of the 9th of February 2017, I think it was you who told the meeting that the retender had come out last night. A lot of front-end activity with workshops, interviews, need to identify people to attend the IT workshop, site visits for Brook House and Tinsley House for other bidders. So it means competitors or would-be competitors
That's right.
were allowed to come in and visit the site. Will be done in early March. And then on the 28th of February, another minute of the SMT, CJS 000492, all of these, Chair, please, if you will, to be adduced in evidence.
Thank you.
Tours of Brook House and Tinsley House by competitors was mentioned. And interestingly, Michelle Brown's updated the meeting on the bid work that she has not had an opportunity to do her day job. So was it diverting? She was complaining to the meeting that she'd been working on the bid and therefore had not been able to do her day job. Was it a distraction?
I think to some extent, yes, it would have been a distraction because it did mean extra work.
And for you?
It certainly meant extra work.
And what kind of work?
Well, I think in the process, it would be working with the bid team.
With the what team?
The bid team.
Is that G4S corporate?
Yeah. Separate to the centre.
Yeah.
We would have been considered the subject matter experts, for want of a better phrase, in terms of responding to some of the questions in the bid.
Well, you said in your witness statement, your first witness statement of paragraph 290, that I would be reasonably heavily involved.
Yes.
Was that an understatement or an overstatement?
I think that was fairly accurate.
Right. Over months?
Yes, it would have been over more than 1 month.
I'd like to show you something that Dan Horton said in his witness statement to the inquiry, and this I would like put up on screen, please. SER 000453, please. At page 21 when you get there, Zainab. I recall, he says at paragraph 84, a decision made by Ben Saunders to run staffing levels below the typical headcount. This was prior to an upcoming contract renewal. The upcoming contract had a lower number of staff than levels at the time. Therefore, Ben took the decision to not recruit to our target number of staff, but wanted to keep staffing to contractual requirements on the basis that if G4S retained the contract, Brook House would not be over headcount. The decision was financially beneficial as all savings increased the margin. And then at 85, whilst my team were able to provide the contractual staffing levels on the whole, it added unnecessary pressure to the operation and made the role more difficult. The contractual staffing level was a minimum. Running on the minimum for the majority of the time led to the feeling of staffing being tight. Had we recruited more staff, there would have been many more days where we didn't feel that we were scraping by. And can I add to that by telling you that when he gave evidence to us last Wednesday, I think it was, on the 16th of March, he explained what he meant by that. And what he said was that you were content to run with vacancies to minimise the transition should we win the contract. In other words, you'd have transitioned into the new contract with the right number of people. Is that what you take from what he's saying?
That's what I think he means. I think my memory of that is slightly different, in that I've never instructed anybody not to recruit up to the contractual headcount. I discussed on a regular basis with the Home Office our staffing position and our strategy and actions to recruit up to the staffing levels, and indeed discussed that at trading review as well. I think I can remember going through a process of profiling for the new bid, and that was done with some external profilers based on the core requirements set out by the Home Office, and was done with others as well. And it wasn't the finished article, but it was a figure that was lower than the existing staffing figures.
So he's right about that.
And I think
So he's right about that.
Well, hang on, because I think what he means, certainly my memory of that is that leading into if we were successful in the bid, because that's by no means certainty. If we were successful in the bid, we would want to go through a process of bringing the new contract requirements into effect. And if there's a differential, then that's something that would typically be managed through mobilisation. So my memory is that I've got a memory of having some conversation around what that mobilisation period might look like, and how that would transition from one contract requirement to another. But that didn't transpire into any decision to not recruit into the existing posts.
Well, he's not. I don't think he's talking about recruitment. I mean, if one reads the first line of 84, the decision he recalled that you made was to run the staffing levels below the typical headcount. That's what he's saying.
That to me implies recruitment, because I think that's what that represents to me, is that he's suggesting that we wouldn't recruit. My view is that we should recruit into the headcount available, and that would enable all the staffing positions to be filled, and therefore the staffing levels to be as the operating model.
Well, to be fair to you, let me read on. The upcoming contract had a lower number of staff than levels at the time. So was he saying that the Home Office was prepared to run Brook House with lower staffing than was present under the current contract? What does that mean?
No, that's not what he's saying.
What's he saying?
I think what he's saying is that the profiling exercise, and all organisations bidding would go through, if they're responsible, would go through a bottom-up profiling exercise, which means that you examine all of the requirements of the contract and the operational solution of the centre, and you appropriately apportion staff to different areas of the requirement, and that then builds up into a profile of staff that an organisation would feel is appropriate to manage. And the importance at the time, because the Home Office has since changed its practice around this, but the approach at the time was that was very much up to individual providers to form a view and then present that in their bid, and it was the most economical appropriate offer that would be successful.
But what do you think he means then by the upcoming contract had a lower number of staff than levels at the time?
That the profile that was being proposed had lower staffing numbers than the current existing model.
So what required for the new contract?
Yes.
Lower numbers?
Yes.
Which is what I thought I was saying. But so you're agreeing with that?
I'm agreeing that what he's talking about, and my recollection is, and that wasn't the final position that was established, but that was a piece of work that was done through some science to evaluate what the profile could be.
And as I said, to be fair to you, reading on, therefore Ben took the decision to not recruit to our target number. That's what he's saying the decision was, but you disagree.
If he's talking about the target number in the existing contract or the new profile, I'm not sure. But my view and instruction was to continue to recruit until we hit our budgeted staffing figure.
And was that a head count, as it were, literally, or was it the number of hours of DCO staff that you had to supply?
It was based on full-time equivalent roles.
Yeah, which meant
the number. Well, the way that it worked, it was quite complex, but it meant.
Well,
that,
let's avoid the complexity.
Okay.
Simplify it, if you will.
Okay. I mean, head count to me implies number of individuals, but you could have a number of part-time individuals who could give a bigger head count, but actually the full-time equivalent is more about what the budget would allow for.
Yeah.
So sometimes there's a benefit to having part-time members of staff because you can offer flexibility to people who prefer that as a work-life balance.
Now, running, as it were, with the same ball, but in a slightly different direction. Yesterday, Sarah Newland gave evidence to us, and she was asked about staffing levels. And she said she had been aware of this conversation around not recruiting the full headcount, but maintaining the required staffing levels over a 24-hour period. Does that ring any bells with you?
Well, no, because what I'm saying is that my direction to the HR advisor was that we should continue to recruit.
Yeah.
And but the way in which the contractor was measured was the number of DCO hours in a 24-hour period.
But she also added this, that you would move staff from Tinsley House to Brook House because the fine or the penalty regime at Tinsley House was more favourable. And she said Tinsley House staff were not as familiar with the resident population, and she raised concerns about it. Do you remember doing that?
Yeah, yes, I do remember moving staff from Tinsley
for the reason she gives.
Well, not entirely, but it was in my mind, if I'm honest. And but the main reason was because the requirements to deliver the operation at Brook were more reliant upon having the right staff than Tinsley were, which was a much more open and flexible kind of regime. I also I should add as well. You're right in the sense, and Sarah's right in the sense that we did used to identify staff members to work at Brook House or Tinsley House, although Tinsley House was open first, and there were a large amount of staff at Tinsley whose contracts were Tinsley specific. New staff coming in that we recruited were on Gatwick IRC contracts, so we would deploy staff to different sites because we wanted people to have familiarity with teamwork and stability. But those on Gatwick contracts were contractually obliged to work across either.
Yeah, but I mean, there's no question, despite what you've just said, that staff were moved between the buildings in order, in part, to save on cost.
No, I would disagree with that. I would think in order to meet contractual requirements.
Well, didn't you agree? I use the word cost, but it's saving on penalty points.
Look, I think sometimes that was the impact of it. Yes.
Yeah. So you're saying it was an indirect benefit.
There was a benefit to it, but those staff were on duty in one sense or another.
But what Sarah Newland appears to be saying is you did it for that reason, not as an indirect benefit.
No, that's not entirely accurate.
Entirely accurate.
Well, the primary reason was to make sure that the operation at Brook House was effective, and at times there were opportunities to move people from Tinsley House to enable
that. Two final topics, Mr. Saunders. First of all, can we put up on screen a witness statement by Paul Gasson, HOM 0332152, please? At page 34, please. And here under the heading Rule 40, Mr. Gasson had been referred to certain documents, and he says, which show I was notified when a detained person was placed on Rule 40. I've been asked why I was notified when a detained person was placed on Rule 40 and how I use this information. The Home Office was notified of all occasions as per Detention Centre Rule 40. Paperwork would have been reviewed to ensure it was completed correctly. And then he says at 122, having been referred to documents relating to removal from association, I've been asked to comment on the information I considered to determine whether an individual was suitable to be placed under Rule 40. Most of the reference documents show that I was notified of the removal from association, not that I authorised it. For the cases where I did authorise removal from association, the information I considered would have been what was presented by G4S and consideration of any alternatives to the relocation. For the remainder, they show that the removal from association had been authorised by the G4S manager, which was the correct process. Now, if we look, please, at the relevant DSO, which is 02/2017, CJS 000676, please, Zainab. Page 11. Right at the top we have paragraph 28, Rule 40, which at rule or sub-paragraph 2 of 40 says, in cases of urgency, the manager of a contracted out detention centre may assume the responsibility of the Secretary of State under paragraph 1, but shall notify the Secretary of State as soon as possible after making the necessary arrangements. And if we roll down, please, to paragraph 31, in bold, in no circumstances must an initial authorisation be given for a period beyond 24 hours. In normal circumstances, any use of Rule 40 or 42 for an initial 24-hour period must be authorised by a manager. That's an executive officer or above from the HOIE IRC team in a contracted out centre. And if we go to the next page for paragraph 32, in cases of urgency, and if we can just go down to footnote 4, to protect life and or the security of the centre, for example, a fight or an assault on another detainee or member of staff. And if the circumstances are such that it is impracticable to seek the authority required in paragraph 31 in advance, the centre or duty manager in a contracted out or HMPPS run centre can make the emergency authorisation so that the authority is considered to begin at that point. In such circumstances, the HOIE IRC manager or the HOIE on-call manager, if out of hours, must be notified immediately. Now, in your experience, in cases of urgency, what happened if you weren't available? I mean, because you're the G4S manager, aren't you, for these purposes that Mr. Gasson talks about, the correct process?
I think that my interpretation would be that would typically be the duty manager or the duty director.
Yeah. When do you think it would have been impracticable to seek authority from you or the Home Office? If you look at the top, it says, if the circumstances are such that it's impracticable to seek the authority required, the centre or duty manager can make the emergency authorisation. So what sort of circumstances made it impracticable?
I would interpret that as being something like overnight, for example.
Yeah. Did DCMs ever authorise?
My understanding is that DCMs did with consultation with the duty director.
And the duty director, who would that be? Would you ever be a duty director? I think you told us you would be.
Yes.
Steve Skirt?
Yes.
Who else?
Members of the senior management team.
So right across the board?
Yeah.
So everybody would, what, on rota or,
yes.
or what? And how long would they be on duty director rota?
Typically 1 weekend in between 6 and 8 weeks,
Yeah.
and typically over 24-hour period.
Yeah. So let me understand this. DCMs would be allowed to authorise in what circumstances, just so we're clear, that if the duty director wasn't available?
So my interpretation of this is that, you know, in urgent situations such as they describe in here, for example, if there's an assault or a fight, or if somebody is acting in a violent manner or a manner that is unsafe, or which is going to put at risk the safety and security of the centre, then I would typically expect a manager to manage that risk, and that could involve using Rule 40.
Yeah.
And the principles of this, in my understanding, and I think I remember talking to Paul Gasson about it at the time, because this was a new DSO in July 2017.
Well, July 2017, as we saw.
So is that the onus was on the importance of the Home Office authorising this for any length of time, but up until to cover a kind of overnight period, then there was a provision for us as the provider to manage the behaviour safely.
Yeah. Can we look at a PSU investigation report? It's dated the 30th of January 2018 and relates to a detainee D1538. But can we just look at the recommendations? CJS 003348 at page 25 and 26. This relates to this individual who was assaulted allegedly by detainee custody officers on the 3rd of June 2017 and subject to homophobic comments on the 28th. And this is the PSU report, the style of which I'm sure you'll be familiar with, Mr. Saunders. And if we go to recommendations at paragraph 9, it's noted that an argument may exist to suggest the decision to place D1538 into Rule 40 should have devolved to the Home Office, as it is arguable no case of urgency existed in this instance. Home Office evidence supports that as the detainee displayed quite aggressive, abusive and threatening behaviour towards the centre staff, I wouldn't be involved in the decision to place him on Rule 40. This is questionable, and it is considered worthy of further exploration as to the policy guidance in such circumstances. This is considered pertinent as the ultimate responsibility for the centre lies with the Secretary of State through devolved authority to the Home Office. Whilst it may not necessarily have impacted on the decision to appropriately place D1538 into Rule 40 based on his behaviour and actions, it's considered that sufficient time existed to allow input into that decision by the Home Office. And then, in terms of the recommendation, national policy and procedure at 9.3 and under, Rule 42 states, and we saw that, centre managers may assume the responsibility of the Secretary of State, which implies the Secretary of State is the proper body to authorise Rule 40. Such assumption of responsibility is only devolved in cases of urgency. As stated at 9.1 and 9.2, it's considered there was sufficient, suitable time for the Home Office to be consulted prior to Rule 40 being implemented. It's noted there was sufficient time to notify the Home Office, thus fulfilling that obligation under Rule 42. It's therefore recommended that consideration be given to clarification of what constitutes cases of urgency and reinforcing where the prime authority lies for authorising Rule 40. It's noted that since events described herein, DSO 2 of 2017, July 2017 has been issued, we looked at that. DSO 2 of 2017, paragraph 31, details the Home Office as the prime decision maker in authorising the use of Rule 40. Paragraph 32 and footnote 4 detail authority can be devolved in cases of urgency. Paragraph 30 details the requirement to document all alternatives considered and discounted before Rule 40 is authorised and engaged. It's also noted, however, that evidence was supplied to the investigation post-July 2017 to support that Home Office officers appear to be unsure of their responsibilities to act as prime authority in authorising Rule 40 in all circumstances where time allows. It's considered this may have a serious impact on future cases where justification of and authority for the use of Rule 40 is questioned, and the action point is detention services give consideration to reinforcing DSO 2 of 2017 as to where prime authority lies for implementing Rule 40 and clarifying what constitute cases of urgency and issuing such clarification as necessary. As you point out, this only came into being in July 2017. You were still there a couple of months. Thereafter, did it produce problems, the interpretation of this DSO?
I think I wouldn't describe it necessarily as problems, but it was something for us to work with the Home Office on in order to ensure that we were compliant with the DSO.
And were records made from your understanding of the requirement to document all alternatives, why they were considered or how they were considered and discounted? Was that done?
Yes, there was a very, within the DSO, from memory, there was quite a prescribed template for completion, which involves sections that require that.
One of the things we were told, or we understand, is that a vast majority of these authorisations was made by DCMs, and I can't say if it was exactly after this DSO. But first of all, did a similar regime apply before this DSO or not?
I think from memory, I think it was similar, and from memory, it wasn't uncommon for DCMs, sorry, to authorise in the first instance.
So when you say in the first instance, what do you mean by that?
Well, because in essence, DCMs would be responsible for managing incidents and making sure that people are safe, and sometimes that meant taking action to separate those who are violent.
So are you agreeing, whether before, during or just after this DSO came into being, that DSMs were largely making these kinds of decisions on Rule 40, the authorisations?
I think DCMs would authorise Rule 40. They would also be required to communicate with the duty director about that, to understand the rationale for use of Rule 40 and what the behaviours were that caused that risk to be managed, and what was being done to de-escalate and return that individual back into normal regime.
And that was after the authorisation had been given, was it, or before it was?
My recollection is that it was after the authorisation had been given.
So you were giving an historical review of why it was done and what was being done to manage the situation?
Yes.
Right. Finally, Mr. Saunders, you're working for Mighty now?
Yes, I.
And can you tell us what you do for Mighty?
I'm Director of Business Development.
So you're not managing a centre any longer?
No.
But working within the corporate structure?
Yes.
Right. Can we just put up, please, finally, in terms of documentation, your second witness statement, KEN 000003, and go all the way to page 13, please, Zina. And you'll remember, having made a first witness statement, you were asked a series of further questions to consider, Mr. Saunders, and it's all the way down to question 20. As soon as the Panorama programme aired, I knew that my time at G4S was limited. A few weeks after, Paul Kempster, and pausing there, we learned through Mr. Petherick yesterday that he was appointed as a Chief Operating Officer in May 2017, but because of certain civil service restrictions, he couldn't really come on board properly until the 1st of November. But clearly he was operational after Panorama, and Paul Kempster called you as you say, asking for my attendance at a meeting with him and the HR director at a local hotel. Who was the HR director?
Heather Noble.
And we met as arranged, and during the meeting Paul Kempster explained that I was being suspended from duty, that I may wish to consider an option to resign and negotiate a settlement agreement. I was told that the alternative to this option was to face a disciplinary process. In the face of the options presented to me, I resigned from the company, and there was a settlement agreement. I'm not going to ask you about the terms of it, but that, in fact, is what happened. What I'm interested in asking you, given that you were faced with these options, is what was the option to face a disciplinary process? What disciplinary process were you to face if you didn't go for the negotiated settlement and your own resignation?
I wasn't entirely sure what the disciplinary process would involve.
Yeah.
But my experience of situations like this is that often the centre director is the person to leave, and I understand the reasons for that. You know, this happened on my watch. You know, I take responsibility. You know, for my role in managing Brook House, and I understand that that's not uncommon in terms of you know, your name being above the door.
Well, presumably you didn't make the decision on the spot, or am I wrong? Did you decide
No,
there
I didn't
and then?
decide on the spot.
No. So you must have gone away with an idea, well, these are the options. It's I resign and get a negotiated settlement out of this and move on with my life, or I face a disciplinary process if I put up a fight. Now, you must have asked the question, well, what are the allegations going to be?
I asked myself the question, but I also.
Well, what answer did you give yourself?
Well, I didn't believe that there was anything from a disciplinary point of view that I couldn't really understand what, from a disciplinary point of view, that would involve.
Well, what did Mr. Kempster and Miss Noble tell you?
Well, they didn't go into particular detail.
Well, they must have done, Mr. Soldo. You don't sit there in a local hotel over a cup of tea, coffee, or whatever it was, and here are the options they're giving you, and you don't ask the question. Well, what are you talking about? What have I done?
Well, in the meeting, the only thing that was mentioned to me was the absence of a use of force meeting.
An absence of a use of force meeting for
yeah.
what?
I imagine that was related to scrutiny of use of force incidents.
Across the board?
As part of having a process in place.
Yeah. For all uses of force, is that what they told, or one in particular?
All uses, generally.
Right. So that was the only allegation you understood?
That's right.
Nothing else?
Nothing else.
And if that disciplinary process had taken its course, if that had been the option, was that a fair complaint that was made against you, do you think, or not?
I don't think it would necessarily be a dismissible issue.
Well, the disciplinary process can result in all sorts of different
no, that's true.
outcomes. But this one was made clear to you. It was, you know, you either jump or we'll push you.
I think that was ultimately the decision I was facing.
Yeah.
The option I was facing was either leave through what had been a very difficult circumstance.
Yeah.
I'm sure you can imagine. You know, I did a lot of reflection on, you know, after seeing the Panorama programme, and yeah, I think for me it was the best option to take.
Yeah. So that's it. It was failure to have a system in place for use of force review or review meetings.
That's the only point that was mentioned.
The only point, and you've never discovered anything more since.
No.
That's it.
Yeah.
I mean, was there any correspondence that took place between any representatives on your behalf and G4S before you decided to resign, or was that it? You have a meeting, you go home, think about it, and then you just decide to resign and negotiate a settlement, or was there exchanges of correspondence to discover what G4S was saying about you before you made the decision to go?
No, I made the decision to resign.
And how long after this meeting?
I can't remember exactly, but approximately a week.
And you mind me asking, any lawyers involved in the interim, or did you do it by yourself?
No, I engaged a lawyer to support me.
Yeah. But as far as you're concerned, there was no inquiries made of G4S. What disciplinary process would Ben Saunders be meeting if he decided to fight his corner?
No, that's right.
Right, okay. Right, thank you, Mr. Saunders. Chair, if you have any questions?
Thank you, Mr. Altman. I just have one, Mr. Saunders. Mr. Altman asked you about the self-harm incidents and the level of scrutiny in terms of identifying whether there had actually been any failures of the process, G4S process, and therefore that they should be self-reported. I just want to ask you a question, if you can kind of look back and reflect, knowing now and having worked there for a long time, does it seem realistic to you that of 60 incidents, that none of those incidents of self-harm would have involved any failure, large or small, of process when you look back on it?
I remember feeling at the time that I had faith in the scrutiny process. When we talk about 60 incidents of self-harm, then I would point out that there is a range of seriousness of self-harm within that. So 60 sounds like a big number, but that could be a range in there. Without knowing the detail, I don't know, but there could be a range of severity of self-harm. My view of the knowledge and training and governance around the ACDT process was generally good, and I looked at that myself. I draw my views on that from examining the ACDT logs when I was duty director. So I would see the reviews, the plans, and people took that very seriously, and the comments, the observations that were made by the officers. And the quality assurance checks that were done against those logs. So I do think there was a good level of scrutiny into that process.
Okay, thank you. I had no other questions. Thank you for coming today. I know you've been with us for a long spell and it's not an easy process, but I'm very grateful.
Pleasure.
Thank you.
Chair, 10 o'clock tomorrow.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
All right.